Welcome. Before our story begins, you may follow and like the video if you wish. Now settle into a comfortable position. Close your eyes when you are ready. Tonight I shall tell you of a quiet house, a missing letter, and a lantern that seemed to burn without a hand to carry it. It was during the final week of November in the year 1889 that the matter first came to our attention. London had been covered by a thin and patient rain. It was not a violent storm. The rain simply remained. It rested upon the windows of Baker Street and softened every sound from the road below. Inside our sitting room, the fire was low. Holmes sat in his usual chair. His long fingers were placed together beneath his chin. For nearly half an hour, he had said nothing. A small chemical flame burned upon the table beside him. Its pale blue light moved gently across several glass tubes. I had learned not to disturb Holmes during such silences. His mind was rarely still. Even when his body appeared completely at rest, some hidden part of him was always examining, separating, and arranging facts. At last, there came a careful knock at our door. Mrs. Hudson entered. A gentleman was waiting downstairs, she told us. He had arrived without an appointment. He also appeared deeply troubled. Holmes glanced toward the clock. 10 minutes past 9, he said. A strange hour for a country solicitor to arrive with mud upon only one side of his boots. Mrs. Hudson stared at him. The gentleman has not yet entered the room, Mr. Holmes. No, Holmes replied, but he paused beneath our window. His shadow crossed the curtain. He carries a narrow leather case. The clasp is shaped like a solicitor's seal. As for the mud, we shall confirm that shortly. Mrs. Hudson gave the smallest sigh. She had long ago stopped asking how Holmes noticed such things. A moment later, our visitor was shown inside. He was a tall man of perhaps 50 years. His clothes were respectable, though damp from the rain. He held a brown leather case beneath one arm. As Holmes had predicted, there was dark mud along the outer edge of his right boot. The left boot was almost clean. "My name is Edwin Harcourt," he said. "I am a solicitor from Guildford." Holmes invited him to sit near the fire. "You traveled by train," Holmes said, "but the mud came before you reached the station. Your carriage wheel threw it against your right side. You sat beside the driver rather than inside the carriage." Mr. Harcourt looked surprised. "The carriage belonged to my client. The inside seat was wet, so I sat at the front." "And you carried that case beneath your coat during the journey," Holmes continued. "Yet you have held it openly since leaving Waterloo." "That is also true." Holmes leaned back. "Then the case contains something you feared might be damaged by rain, but no longer fear will be stolen." Mr. Harcourt placed the leather case upon his knees. "It contained a document," he said. "The document has disappeared." Holmes looked briefly at me. His expression had changed. The evening was no longer empty. Our visitor explained that he represented an elderly widow named Mrs. Eleanor Vale. She lived at Ashcombe House, a quiet estate several miles outside Guildford. Her husband had died 12 years earlier. Since then, Mrs. Vale had remained in the house with only a small household staff. 2 days before Mr. Harcourt's visit to Baker Street, she had decided to alter her will. The new document had been prepared in his office. It was then delivered to Ashcombe House for her signature. The document was placed in the library desk, Mr. Harcourt said. Mrs. Vale signed it in my presence. 2 servants witnessed it. I returned it to this case. Then we heard a cry from the upper floor. What kind of cry? I asked. A frightened cry. It came from Mrs. Vale's companion, Miss Lydia Gray. Everyone had hurried upstairs. They found Miss Gray standing in a corridor near the western staircase. She claimed that she had seen a light moving behind a curtain at the far end of the passage. The curtain covered a tall window. There was no balcony outside it. There was also no ledge wide enough for a person to stand upon. Yet a warm yellow light had passed slowly from one side of the curtain to the other. Miss Gray believed someone had been outside the window. Mr. Harcourt and the servants searched the corridor. They found nothing. The window remained locked from the inside. When Mr. Harcourt returned to the library, his leather case was still on the desk. Its clasp was closed. However, the signed document inside it had vanished. Was anything else taken? Holmes asked. Nothing. Did the document leave a clear financial advantage to one person? Not exactly. That is what makes the matter so delicate. Mr. Harcourt looked down at his hands. Mrs. Vale had one son, Charles. He lived in London and visited rarely. Under the old will, Charles would inherit almost the entire estate. Under the new will, Ashcombe House would be sold. The money would be divided between Charles, Miss Gray, and several charitable institutions. Charles would still receive a large amount. He would simply receive less than before. Who knew about the change? Holmes asked. Mrs. Vale, Miss Gray, myself, and the 2 witnesses. Who were the witnesses? The housekeeper, Mrs. Bell, and the gardener, Thomas Reed. Holmes stood and walked toward the window. The rain traced thin silver lines across the glass. Did anyone remain near the library while the others went upstairs? No one, as far as I know. As far as you know, Holmes repeated softly. Mr. Harcourt opened the leather case. He placed it upon our table. The case was plain but well made. Its brass clasp showed no damage. Holmes examined the leather beneath the lamp. He did not touch it at first. He simply turned it toward the light. Then he brought it close to his face. There are 3 recent marks, he said. I could see only a few faint scratches. Holmes pointed to them one by one. The first was made by your own thumbnail. The second came from the edge of the library desk. The third is a narrow line of pale wax. Wax? Mr. Harcourt asked. Beeswax, I believe. Holmes touched the mark and examined his fingertip. There is also a trace of lavender. Mr. Harcourt appeared confused. I noticed no candle in the library. Perhaps the wax did not come from a candle. Holmes closed the case. Tell me about the curtain. It is made of heavy green material. It hangs over the western window. And the light moved behind it. According to Miss Gray. Did she say it flickered? Mr. Harcourt considered the question. No. She said it moved steadily. Holmes returned to his chair. That is useful. I knew his manner well. A small structure had already begun to form within his thoughts. I could not yet see its shape. Holmes, however, had found the first stones. We shall travel to Ashcombe House tomorrow, he said. Mr. Harcourt breathed with visible relief. But before you leave, I have one final question. When the cry was heard, did Mrs. Vale seem frightened by the light? Mr. Harcourt frowned. No, that was rather strange. She seemed tired, but not frightened. Did she look at Miss Gray? For a moment. And what did you observe? I cannot say. Holmes's voice grew quieter. Try. Mr. Harcourt closed his eyes as he searched his memory. Mrs. Vale looked disappointed, he said at last. Not surprised, disappointed. Holmes nodded. Outside, a carriage passed through the rain. Its wheels made a low and distant sound. The missing will is only part of your difficulty, Holmes said. Someone in that house expected the light to appear. Someone else expected the document to disappear. Those two expectations may belong to the same person. He looked toward the dying fire, or they may not. The rain had stopped by the following morning. A pale mist remained over the fields beyond Guildford. Holmes and I completed the rest of our journey in a small, hired carriage. The road to Ashcombe House was narrow and quiet. Bare branches met above us, forming a grey arch. Now and then, drops of water fell from the trees. They struck the roof of the carriage with a soft and regular sound. Holmes had brought Mr. Harcourt's leather case with him. During the journey, he examined it several times. He paid particular attention to the pale line of wax. You believe the wax is important? I asked. Everything is important at first, Watson. And later? Later, most things become unimportant. The difficulty is knowing which ones deserve to remain. Ashcombe House appeared through the mist shortly before noon. It was a broad stone building with ivy along its eastern wall. The western side faced a neglected garden. Beyond the garden stood a line of dark yew trees. The house did not seem threatening. It seemed tired. Its windows reflected the dull sky. No smoke rose from two of its 4 chimneys. Mrs. Bell, the housekeeper, received us at the door. She was a small, orderly woman with silver hair. Her black dress carried the faint scent of lavender. Holmes noticed it immediately. I saw his eyes move toward the cuffs of her sleeves. There was a slight shine upon the fabric. It was the kind of shine left by furniture polish. Mrs. Vale is expecting you, she said. We were taken to the morning room. Mrs. Eleanor Vale sat beside the window. She appeared to be nearly 70 years old. Her back was straight. Her hands rested calmly upon a walking stick. Her eyes were clear and observant. Miss Lydia Gray stood beside the fireplace. She was a quiet woman in her early 30s. Her face showed the weariness of someone who had slept badly for several nights. Mrs. Vale greeted us without ceremony. "I asked Mr. Harcourt to speak with you," she said. "I do not care for public attention. I care even less for mysteries inside my own home." Holmes bowed. "Then we shall try to leave you with neither." Mrs. Vale gave the faintest smile. Holmes asked her to describe the evening again. Her account agreed with Mr. Harcourt's in every important detail. The will had been signed in the library. A cry had come from upstairs. Everyone had rushed to the western corridor. They had returned to find the document missing. "Did you see the light yourself?" Holmes asked. "I saw only the final part of it," Mrs. Vale replied. A yellow glow passed behind the lower half of the curtain. "Was it bright?" "No. It was similar to a lantern seen through fog." "Did it rise or fall?" "It remained at the same height." "Did it flicker?" Mrs. Vale paused. "Not that I recall." Holmes looked toward Miss Gray. She held her hands together. "I saw it more clearly," she said. "It moved from left to right. Then it vanished." "What did you think it was?" "A person outside the window." "Yet the window stands above the ground." "I know that now. At the time I was startled." Holmes asked if she had touched the curtain. Miss Gray shook her head. "I called for help. I did not go closer." "Why?" She looked toward Mrs. Vale. "Several weeks ago, I saw the same light." The room became very still. Mr. Harcourt had not mentioned this. Miss Gray explained that the first appearance had occurred shortly after midnight. She had been walking toward her room when she noticed a yellow glow behind the western curtain. It remained visible for several seconds. Then it disappeared. On the following morning, she found the window locked. She had told no one except Mrs. Vale. "And what did Mrs. Vale say?" Holmes asked. "She told me that old houses often produce simple explanations for strange events." "A sensible observation," Holmes said. Mrs. Vale tapped one finger against her walking stick. "I also told her not to frighten the servants." Holmes requested permission to examine the library and the western corridor. Mrs. Vale agreed. Before we left the room, he turned to Mrs. Bell. "What kind of polish do you use upon the library furniture?" "Beeswax polish, sir." "With lavender oil?" "Yes. Mrs. Vale dislikes the smell of turpentine." Holmes thanked her. The pale mark upon the leather case now had a simple explanation. The case had rested against a recently polished surface. Yet Holmes did not dismiss it. He rarely dismissed a fact merely because it had become ordinary. The library was a long room on the ground floor. Tall shelves covered 2 walls. A large writing desk stood near the center. Its surface was smooth and dark, There were two doors. One opened into the entrance hall. The other opened into a narrow passage used by the servants. Holmes knelt beside the desk. He examined the wood at eye level. Then he took a small lens from his pocket. "The case stood here," Mr. Harcourt said. So it did. Holmes pointed toward a faint rectangular shape in the polish. Most of the desk had a soft shine. The place where the case had rested was slightly duller. Near one corner, however, there was a second mark. It was short and curved. "Someone lifted the case," I said. "Perhaps," Holmes replied, "or someone turned it." He opened the empty case and studied the clasp. There was no lock. The brass fitting closed with gentle pressure. A person could open and close it in seconds. Holmes then crossed to the servants' door. A thin strip of carpet ran along the passage beyond it. He lowered himself and touched the edge of the carpet. "Recently cleaned," he said. Mrs. Bell confirmed that the passage had been swept on the morning after the document vanished. Holmes did not appear disappointed. Instead, he looked at the lower part of the door. A tiny gray thread had caught against the hinge. He removed it with a pair of tweezers. "Wool?" I asked. "Old wool," he said. "Possibly from a blanket, possibly from the carpet itself." He placed the thread inside a folded piece of paper. We then climbed the western staircase. The corridor above was long and rather cold. Several bedrooms opened from its eastern side. The western wall held portraits and a single tall window. A green curtain covered the window from ceiling to floor. The fabric was heavy. It had been drawn closed, though daylight showed faintly around its edges. Holmes stood several feet away. "Show me where you were," he said to Miss Grey. She stopped near the top of the staircase. "And the light traveled in which direction?" She raised one hand. "From that side to the other." Holmes asked everyone to remain still. He crossed to the curtain and drew it aside. The window behind it was narrow. Its iron catch was old but secure. Outside, the stone wall fell almost 20 feet to the garden. There was no balcony. A thin decorative ledge ran beneath the window. It was scarcely wide enough for a bird. Holmes opened the window. Cold air moved into the corridor. He leaned outward and examined the stone. Then he looked down. Directly below us stood an old wooden frame covered with dead climbing roses. It reached almost halfway to the window. "A determined man could climb it," I said. "A determined man could also break his neck," Holmes replied. "The wood has not supported human weight in many years." He closed the window. Next, he examined the curtain. He passed his hand slowly across the fabric. Near the bottom, he found a small patch that felt stiffer than the rest. There was no stain. There was only a slight difference in texture. "Wax again?" I asked. "No." "Starch." Miss Grey looked puzzled. "The curtain has not been washed for years. That is why the presence of fresh starch interests me." Holmes knelt and examined the wooden floor. He found 2 shallow scratches near the wall. They were parallel. Each was less than an inch long. Something with a flat base had been placed there and moved slightly. Holmes then stepped behind the curtain. For several moments, only his shoes remained visible. At last, he spoke. "Watson, stand where Miss Grey stood." I returned to the staircase. Holmes struck a match behind the curtain. A warm glow appeared through the green fabric. It remained still. "Does this resemble the light?" he asked. Miss Grey nodded. "Yes, but the light moved." Holmes moved the match carefully from left to right. The glow traveled behind the curtain. "That is very similar," she said. The match went out. Holmes emerged. "A person did not need to be outside the window," I said. "No," he replied. "A person needed only to stand behind the curtain." "But Miss Grey would have seen that person leave." "Would she?" Holmes pointed toward the lower edge of the curtain. The fabric hung nearly to the floor. Then he pointed toward the wall. Behind one fold was a narrow wooden panel. Its paint matched the surrounding wood. I had not noticed it. Holmes pressed against one side. The panel opened several inches. Behind it was darkness. Mrs. Vale looked at the opening without surprise. "It is an old linen cupboard," she said. "It has not been used since my husband died." Holmes opened the panel fully. The space behind it was deep enough for a person to stand inside. Several empty shelves lined the back wall. Dust covered most of them. On the lowest shelf rested a small brass lantern. Its glass had been removed. Beside it lay a square of starched white cloth. Miss Grey gave a quiet breath. Holmes lifted the cloth. "It was fastened over the lantern," he said. "The fabric softened the light. It also prevented the flame from flickering visibly through the curtain." He examined the cupboard floor. There were marks in the dust. Someone had stood there recently. There was also a clean space where a small object had rested. "The lantern explains the moving glow," I said. "It explains how the glow was made," Holmes replied. "It does not explain who made it, nor does it explain why the missing document was the true object of the performance." He looked along the corridor. "The light was never meant to frighten everyone." Holmes turned to Miss Grey. "It was meant to make one particular person cry out." Miss Grey became pale. "You believe someone knew I would be in the corridor?" "I believe someone knew your habits," Holmes replied. "You visit Mrs. Vale's room every evening. You then return by this staircase. A light behind the curtain would be certain to attract your attention. But why choose me?" "Because you had seen it before." Holmes's answer was calm. "The first appearance taught you to fear the second. It also gave your second account greater weight. If you cried out, the household would come upstairs. The library would be left empty." Mr. Harcourt looked toward the open cupboard. "Then the first light was merely a preparation." "So it appears." Mrs. Vale remained near the staircase. Her expression was difficult to read. "Can you identify the person who stood in that cupboard?" she asked. "Not yet," Holmes replied. "But I can identify several things that person understood." He counted them quietly. The person knew the household's evening routine. The person knew about the hidden cupboard. The person knew Miss Grey had seen the earlier light. The person also knew exactly when the new will would be signed. Finally, the person required a way to leave the cupboard without being seen. Holmes entered the narrow space once more. He removed the lantern and examined the back wall. One shelf appeared darker along its right edge. He pressed it. The shelf moved inward. A narrow section of the cupboard turned silently upon hidden hinges. Behind it was a steep servants' stairway. It descended into the passage beside the library. Mrs. Bell stared at the opening. "I had forgotten that stair existed," she said. Mrs. Vale shook her head. "It was closed when the house was altered." "Closed from ordinary use," Holmes said, "but not sealed." We followed him down the narrow stairs. Dust lay thickly along the edges. The center, however, showed several soft disturbances. The steps had been wiped. Someone had tried to remove their footprints. At the bottom, the hidden stair ended behind another wooden panel. It opened into the servants' passage. The library door stood only a few yards away. "The plan becomes simple," Holmes said. "A person waits in the cupboard with the lantern. Miss Grey sees the light and cries out. The household gathers upstairs. The person descends through the hidden stairway. They enter the library, open the case, and remove the will." "Then they return the same way?" I asked. "No." Holmes pointed at the dust near the lowest step. The disturbed marks traveled downward. There were no similar marks returning upward. The thief left through the passage. By then, the others were still examining the window. Mr. Harcourt frowned. Anyone leaving the passage would have been seen in the entrance hall. Unless that person belonged in the servants' part of the house. All eyes moved towards Mrs. Bell. The housekeeper's face tightened. "I did not take the document." Holmes regarded her gently. "I have not said that you did. But you believe a servant was involved. I believe the person wished to appear natural in this passage. That is not the same thing." We returned to the library. Holmes requested that every person who had been in the house that evening should join us. Within several minutes, the small group had assembled. There was Mrs. Vale. There was Miss Grey. Mrs. Bell stood near the door. Thomas Reed, the gardener, remained beside the bookcase. He was a broad, quiet man of nearly 60. A young maid named Clara stood behind him. Mr. Harcourt sat at the desk. The only absent person was Charles Vale. Mrs. Vale's son had returned to London on the morning after the will disappeared. Holmes first addressed the gardener. "Mr. Reed, you witnessed the document?" "I did, sir." "You also knew the western cupboard?" "I knew it as a boy. My father worked on the estate." "Have you used the hidden stair recently?" "No." Reed's answer was firm. His boots carried dark garden soil. The soil was packed deeply into the worn leather. Holmes glanced at them only once. "You polish the brass lanterns in the garden store." "Sometimes." "With what?" "Chalk and oil." Holmes thanked him. He then turned to Clara. The maid said she had been in the kitchen when Miss Gray cried out. She followed Mrs. Bell upstairs. She remembered seeing Reed near the entrance hall. He had arrived from the rear door only moments earlier. Mrs. Bell confirmed her account. "Where was Mr. Charles Vale?" Holmes asked. "In the dining room," said Mrs. Bell. "He came upstairs after the rest of us." "Did he arrive before or after the light disappeared?" "After." This interested Holmes. Charles had not been among those who first rushed to the corridor. He had remained below. He had therefore possessed an opportunity to enter the library. Yet he had no reason to use the hidden stair or create the light. He could simply have waited for the cry. Holmes asked to examine Charles Vale's room. Mrs. Vale gave permission. The room was on the eastern side of the house. It was neat but impersonal. Charles appeared to keep few possessions there. Holmes examined the writing table. He looked inside the fireplace. A small amount of gray ash remained beneath the grate. Most of it came from ordinary coal. Mixed within it were several pale fragments. Holmes collected them upon a sheet of paper. "Burned writing paper?" I asked. "Yes, but not the missing will." "How can you know?" "The document was prepared on thick legal paper. These remains are thin. They also carry a blue edge." Mr. Harcourt leaned closer. "My office uses blue-edged legal paper. Your will may have had a blue cover, but the inner pages were cream." Holmes separated the fragments with the point of a knife. One piece carried part of a handwritten word. Only 3 letters survived. The letters were I, N, and G. Another fragment showed the lower half of a number. Holmes placed both inside his notebook. He next inspected the wardrobe. A traveling coat hung inside. Its shoulders were dry. The lower edge held several drops of old candle wax. The wax was white. The lantern in the cupboard contained yellow wax. Charles might have known of the plan. The room did not prove that he had performed it. As we crossed back toward the stairs, Holmes stopped beside a table in the entrance hall. Several letters lay upon a silver tray. One envelope was addressed to Mrs. Vale. Its stamp had been cancelled in London that morning. The handwriting was narrow and slanted. Holmes did not touch it. He only looked. Mrs. Vale noticed his interest. "It is from my son," she said. "He writes to say that he will return tomorrow." "May I ask why?" He did not explain. Holmes turned toward the front door. Through the glass, I could see the garden fading into the afternoon mist. "We have examined the place where the light appeared," he said. "We have also examined the place where the document disappeared." "What remains?" I asked. "The place where it was intended to go." Mr. Harcourt stared at him. "You believe the will is still in the house?" I believe it was removed for a purpose. Burning it would not be enough. Mrs. Vale could sign another copy. The thief needed something more useful than destruction. He asked Mrs. Vale whether the missing will contained any unusual provision. She hesitated. At last she explained. Her husband had left several sealed family papers in Mr. Harcourt's care. The papers were not to be opened unless Ashcombe House was sold. The new will instructed that the house should be sold after her death. It would therefore cause the sealed papers to be opened. The old will allowed Charles to keep the estate. Under that arrangement, the papers might remain sealed forever. "What do they contain?" I asked. "I do not know," Mrs. Vale replied. "My husband never told me." Holmes looked at Mr. Harcourt. The solicitor shifted uncomfortably. "I have respected my client's instructions," he said. "The packet remains sealed in my office." Who knows of its existence? Mrs. Vale, her son, myself, perhaps Miss Grey. Miss Grey shook her head. I knew nothing about it. Holmes walked slowly around the library. He paused beside the bookshelves. The missing will was not stolen merely to protect an inheritance, he said. It was stolen to keep a secret closed. Mrs. Vale looked toward the darkening window. My husband had many secrets. One of them, said Holmes, has recently frightened someone. He crossed to a small bell beside the fireplace and rang for Mrs. Bell. When she arrived, he asked an unexpected question. Who requested that the library desk be polished on the morning the will was signed? Mrs. Bell appeared surprised. Mr. Charles Vale, sir. Was that unusual? Yes. Mr. Vale rarely notices such things. What exactly did he say? He said his mother would be signing important papers. He wanted the room to look respectable. Holmes nodded. And who polished it? I did. Did Mr. Vale remain in the room? For a short while. He moved several books and papers from the desk. Holmes opened Mr. Harcourt's case again. He examined the wax mark beneath the afternoon light. Then he smiled very slightly. The polish did not merely leave a mark, he said. It recorded one. I looked more carefully. The pale line crossed the lower edge of the case. Beside it was a faint impression shaped like half of a thumb. The person who turned the case had polish upon one hand, I said. Exactly. Fresh polish remained soft for several hours. Mrs. Bell used a cloth. Her hands would have been protected. He turned toward the housekeeper. Did you give the cloth to anyone? Yes. Mr. Vale asked for it. He said there was a mark I had missed. Holmes closed the case. Then Charles Vale handled the polished desk shortly before the signing. He also handled this case while the others were upstairs. Mr. Harcourt rose. Then Charles took the will. He almost certainly opened the case, Holmes said, but that does not mean he planned the light. The distinction surprised us all. Holmes looked toward Miss Grey. You saw the first light several weeks ago. At that time, no new will had been written. The plan began before Charles knew the date of the signing. Mrs. Vale's hand tightened around her walking stick. Then there were two plans. Yes, Holmes replied. Two plans that happened to meet in the same corridor. Outside, the mist pressed against the windows. The room grew dim and silent. Somewhere inside the old house, a clock began to strike 4. It stopped after the 3rd chime. Holmes turned his head toward the sound. "Which clock is that?" he asked. "The clock in my husband's study," Mrs. Vale replied. "It has been unreliable for years." "Where is the study?" "Above the library." We climbed the eastern staircase and entered a small room overlooking the front garden. The air inside was cold. A tall clock stood against the wall. Its pendulum had stopped. Holmes opened the wooden case. He studied the mechanism. Then he reached behind the clock and drew out a folded piece of cream paper. Mr. Harcourt gave a quiet exclamation. It was the missing will. The seals and signatures remained intact. Mrs. Vale looked at the document for a long moment. "Why hide it there?" she asked. "Because Charles did not intend to destroy it," Holmes said. "He intended to return it." Mr. Harcourt appeared astonished. "Return it?" After learning what was inside the sealed family papers, Holmes placed the will upon the desk. Charles knew that the new document would cause those papers to be opened. He feared what they might reveal. He needed time. If the will disappeared, the signing could be delayed. He could then visit your office, learn what the packet contained, and decide what to do next. "But the packet is sealed," said Mr. Harcourt. "Your office clerk may be less careful than you are." The solicitor's expression changed. Holmes removed the burned fragments from his notebook. "The remains in Charles's fireplace came from a letter written upon your office paper. Someone sent him information. The surviving letters belong to the word Tuesday or signing. The number may have referred to an appointment or a payment." Mr. Harcourt lowered his eyes. "My junior clerk left my employment yesterday. That may not be a coincidence." Mrs. Vale looked toward the recovered will. "My son believed there was something shameful in those papers." "Yes, but he did not know what it was." "Did he create the lantern trick?" "No," Holmes said. "He merely used the opportunity it gave him." Miss Grey stood near the doorway. Her face was pale. "Then who made the light?" Holmes closed the clock case. The person who created the light had a different purpose. That person was not trying to steal the will. He looked at Mrs. Vale. "The light was intended for you." Mrs. Vale remained silent. Holmes spoke without accusation. Several weeks earlier, someone had arranged the first appearance. Miss Grey was certain to see it. She was also certain to tell Mrs. Vale. The second light appeared on the evening of the signing. It drew the household upstairs. Yet the person who planned it could not know that Charles would take the will. The lantern performance must therefore have served another purpose. It had gathered several people in the western corridor. It had also opened the hidden cupboard. More importantly, it had forced Mrs. Vale to look toward a place connected with her late husband. "The cupboard was used by my husband," Mrs. Vale said quietly. Holmes nodded. "He used the hidden stair to enter and leave his study without crossing the main hall." "How did you know?" "The stair ends below this room. The dust along the upper door frame is darker than the dust elsewhere. It once carried tobacco smoke. Your husband smoked a strong Turkish tobacco, judging by the box upon the shelf." Mrs. Vale looked at the old wooden box. "My son believed the sealed papers concerned my husband," she said. "So did the person who created the light." Holmes turned toward Thomas Reed. The gardener had followed us into the study. He stood with his cap held between his hands. Reed did not appear surprised. "I only wanted Mrs. Vale to open the cupboard," he said. Miss Grey stared at him. "You frightened me deliberately." "I am sorry, miss. I knew you would call for help. I did not mean any harm." Mrs. Vale regarded him steadily. "What did you expect me to find?" Reed reached into his coat. He removed a small iron key. "My father gave me this before he died," he said. "He told me it opened a box hidden near the old stair. He made me promise not to use it while Mr. Vale was alive." Holmes took the key. It was dark with age. Its teeth were narrow. "The clean space in the cupboard," I said. "A box once stood there." "Yes," Holmes replied. Mrs. Vale looked toward Reed. "Where is it now?" "In the garden store. I moved it after the first light. I thought you might search the cupboard. When you did not, I planned the second light. Why not simply speak to me?" Reed looked down. "My father believed the box contained proof that Mr. Vale had treated someone unfairly. He feared the family would dismiss me if I accused him without evidence." Mrs. Vale's voice softened. "Bring it here." We walked together through the fading afternoon. The mist had begun to lift. Beyond the western garden, the yew trees stood dark and still. Reed led us to a small brick building near the kitchen garden. Inside were tools, empty pots, and sacks of winter soil. From beneath a wooden bench, he removed a narrow metal box. Its surface was covered with rust. Holmes tried the key. The lock opened with a quiet click. Inside we found a bundle of letters. There was also a small account book. The letters had been written more than 20 years earlier. They concerned Reed's father and a piece of land beside the estate. Mr. Vale had purchased the land for a very small amount. He had promised to return part of it after a railway company completed a nearby survey. The promise had never been honored. Reed's father had kept copies of every letter. The account book showed the true value of the land. Mrs. Vale read the documents in silence. At last she closed the book. "My husband was wrong," she said. Reed did not answer. She looked toward him. "The land will be returned to your family. Any money owed will also be paid." Reed's shoulders lowered. For the first time since entering the house, he appeared able to breathe freely. "There is one matter I do not understand," I said. "Why did Reed leave the lantern in the cupboard?" Holmes looked toward the gardener's hands. "Because he expected Mrs. Vale to find it. The lantern was not evidence he wished to hide. It was a sign." "A sign of what?" "Of an old habit. Mr. Vale once used the same lantern when walking through the hidden passage. Reed believed Mrs. Vale would recognize it." Mrs. Vale nodded. "I did recognize it. That is why I was not frightened." Mr. Harcourt's earlier observation returned to me. Mrs. Vale had looked disappointed rather than surprised. She had understood that someone wanted her attention. She had simply failed to understand why. That evening, we gathered once more in the library. The fire burned gently. Mr. Harcourt placed the recovered will inside his leather case. This time, he kept the case beside his chair. Mrs. Vale wrote a short message to her son. She asked him to return to Ashcombe House and explain his actions. She did not ask the police to meet him. "I shall hear the truth from Charles first," she said. "Then I shall decide what must be done." Holmes accepted her decision. The case had involved deception. Yet the missing document had been recovered. No lasting damage had been done. Charles had acted from fear. Reed had acted from a desire for justice. Neither man had understood the plan of the other. Their actions had crossed for only a few minutes. That brief crossing had created what appeared to be a single mystery. As our carriage carried us back toward Guildford, night settled over the fields. The road shone faintly beneath the moon. For some time, Holmes said nothing. I listened to the quiet movement of the wheels. "You knew there were two plans when we found the lantern," I said at last. "I suspected it." "What first suggested it?" "The quality of the distraction." I waited for him to continue. "The lantern was too careful," Holmes said. "It had been softened with starched cloth. Its movement was steady. Its maker did not wish to cause panic. He wished to attract attention." "And Charles?" "Charles needed a sudden distraction. He did not care what form it took. When Miss Grey cried out, he recognized an opportunity. One plan was patient. The other was immediate." Holmes looked out through the carriage window. "The same event can serve two people in entirely different ways, Watson. That is why the result appeared more complicated than either intention. And the wax upon the leather case? It proved that the case had been turned against the polished desk. Charles had expected the clasp to face the other direction. In his haste, he returned the case incorrectly. But Mr. Harcourt did not notice. Most people remember the presence of an object. They rarely remember its exact position. I smiled. "And you do?" "Only when the position speaks." The distant lights of Guildford appeared ahead of us. They were small and warm against the night. I thought of the yellow glow behind the green curtain. It had seemed like the beginning of something dark. In truth, it had guided us toward an old promise. It had also brought a hidden injustice into the light. Several days later, Mrs. Vale wrote to us. Charles had returned. He admitted that he had paid Mr. Harcourt's clerk for information. He had believed the sealed papers contained proof of an old scandal involving his father. The packet was eventually opened. It contained nothing shameful. There were only business records, several personal letters, and instructions concerning a charitable gift. Charles had feared a secret that did not exist. Reed, meanwhile, had carried the proof of a real wrong in a rusted box. One man had stolen a will to keep the past closed. Another had lit a lantern so the past might finally be seen. Ashcombe House was not sold immediately. Mrs. Vale chose to remain there for several more years. The western cupboard was cleaned. The hidden stair was repaired. The old brass lantern was placed upon a table in the entrance hall. Mrs. Vale kept it there as a reminder. A light, she later wrote, does not always reveal what we expect. Sometimes it shows us what has been waiting quietly beside us. My friend Sherlock Holmes rarely spoke of the case again. To him, its solution had been simple once the two intentions were separated. To me, however, it remained one of our gentler adventures. No violent criminal waited in the shadows. No terrible danger followed us through the night. There was only an old house. There was a frightened son. There was a patient gardener. And there was a small lantern behind a curtain, shining softly upon the truth. Our journey for tonight has now reached its end. The road is quiet. The lamps are growing distant. You may allow the old house, the rain, and the mystery to fade from your thoughts. Rest well and have a peaceful night.